All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast, and we got an amazing episode for you today. But we aren't in the studio, we aren't on the couch. Ben, where are we?
We're in Bali.
We're in Bali. Folks, we have got an extra special episode today. We brought some folks here, Ben.
Yes.
What did we do?
Q&A day, Bryce. Q&A day. We did lots of learning. We actually spoke seriously about all things property, finance, and money management. It was epic.
It was epic, folks. You got to get into this episode. Let's rip into it now.
Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance, and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. And as I say every week, welcome back to you too, mate. How are you?
I'm very well, and you?
I'm exceptionally well.
It's new. We're somewhere different.
I know. Well, we need to explain to those people who are actually just listening, they're currently on a train or in their car or at the gym, that you and I are in a room that is in Bali at the moment, because you and I have just spent 3 days with an incredible bunch of people.
Awesome bunch of people.
Who have enormous hearts, who wanted to not only come and spend some time talking about property, but they were keen to give back to a community that needs a lot of help. So that is why we are here. Ben, tell us a little bit about the last few days for you in terms of
the highlights. How long have we got?
You got about 90 seconds. So.
Well, obviously we're here for your 50th birthday, so happy birthday
Thank
as well,
you.
which was yesterday as per recording.
Yes.
Anyway, we've obviously gone over to Java, which is another one of the islands in the Indonesian group of islands, and as promised, we went over there to help communities and people who had lost their sight through problems with their eyes and cataracts. And so we went and helped them get their eyesight back, which was absolutely
pretty
insane.
Cool. My favourite bit was we set out to raise $50,000. We smashed that, which is great. But I knew what impact it was going to have on me by going over there. But then as we watched all the people that were around us and see how they were interacting with all the people as well, that brought me an enormous amount of joy to see that and to see the impact that everyone had. So again, for those who are just listening, they are standing around us right now. They have sent us a bunch of questions. So we're going to do something a little bit different with this episode today, where we've got some questions that you and I are going to answer, which is theirs.
Yeah, so this is off the back of our masterclass that we were doing.
Yeah,
so,
we should set the scene, really.
Yeah. So we've done the morning of teaching, and
as part of the encouragement to have these wonderful people join us over here, we said let's get together on the final day and have a mastermind. So we spent all day together. We've just come back from lunch. We did some. We went through some case studies. We had a hot seat. It was really, really cool. You and I did a couple of talks at the beginning, but now we're at the Q&A, Ben. So first one comes from Carolyn, and she is our resident Noosa resident from the Sunshine Coast. She had a question around Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast property markets, particularly apartments, villas, and townhouses. So she says, I hear that land does the heavy lifting and houses are better investments, and yes, for the primary residents in brackets, but I'd like your thoughts on buying into apartments in quality developments, Ben. Not just apartments, but apartments into quality developments, e.g. on the Gold Coast and Noosa. Does location do the heavy lifting?
In this particular case, we're also got to go back to the fundamentals. So the fundamentals are still scarcity. So if there are lots of wonderful apartments with lots of consistent views, and there's no scarcity associated with that, there is a risk. There is a risk of ultimately having some oversupply in those particular markets. Now, we've talked about this before in the sense we're not saying that all medium and high density apartment is bad investing, because we do know that lots of people love to head up to Southeast Queensland and enjoy some great holidays and the like. But what we're talking about here is what's the fundamental drivers that's going to deliver long-term capital growth. And we know part of those is scarcity associated with supply over that long term. Now, what do we know about the coast of Queensland. It's quite long. We know there's still plenty of land there that eventually can be redeveloped into medium and high density accommodation. And through that alone, there's not that scarcity of supply. So what we'd be thinking about then is, well, what other scarcity elements are there? Like, have you got a unique view? Have you got a position that can never be built out in terms of for that particular apartment? Because what you're trying to do is remember that your property is still part of an overall marketplace, and it can't just be your property alone that needs to move. There needs to be a movement in value of those, and that's all fundamentally off the back of land appreciation. And so I would always be saying that depending if you want to get long-term strong capital growth, it wouldn't necessarily be a market that I'd be looking to enter into. I'd be sort of saying more, okay, townhouses or where the productive use of that land hasn't been fully utilised would be a good opportunity for that investment.
Yeah, because I mean, if you have an apartment, we talked about it earlier this morning, but if you have an apartment that's right on a prime piece of land in Sydney that's overlooking the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Opera House, that is a very, very rare piece of dirt that people would like to get their hands on. So if you apply our blanket statement around, try and steer clear of apartments, well then you'd sort of leave your head scratching at that point, going, but I have a look at the resales on those particular ones, and they do pretty good.
Oh, well, that's the uniqueness. I mean, there's no more land there on which to build. There's regulation that limits the size of how tall you can also build as well. Now that might change in 100 years, but it's not going to change anytime soon because it interrupts the view of the Opera House. So that's a classic example of unique scarcity.
So, Carolyn, you've gone to a fair few lengths to underline quality apartments here. You haven't just left it as apartments. You've mentioned it as quality apartments. So, is there a particular block you had in mind, or was it on Hastings Street, or was it right on the Noosa Point, or is there anything sort of special about the type of property that you were looking at when you asked that question?
I suppose that I had in mind a 2-bedroom townhouse, probably 5 minutes from Noosa River, new development. Purchased off the plan, it settled a year and a half ago. Mostly owner occupiers, some renters, probably about 45 units in the dwelling. Double story, two-car garage, 3 bedrooms, north facing, around the 1.1.
So then you start to move into some scarcity elements, right? You're near the Noosa River, you're still close to town, but my initial thoughts are, around 45 units is starting to get a little bit higher, so we start to lose some of that scarcity. But again, if you're getting in close to some of the better parts of Noosa, that could be a positive thing. But we tend to want, if we're going to go for that particular type, we still want to go for the established properties nearby that are similar, largely because, you put in here the depreciation the first 5 years, greater value in depreciation the first 5 years of a new build, and then when you do get extra costs, i.e. increases in body corps and maintenance, kick in both terms of their time frame. So yes, you do get better depreciation benefits when you do buy something newer, but we don't want to get that at the expense of the growth that we might, because we pay a premium for the developer's margin, we pay a premium for the builder's margin. So ultimately, without actually looking at the specific development, still prefer to go down the established path.
I've got some counter questions for Carolyn in terms of, do you know much about all of the other land and houses and prices in that area?
Yes.
A bit?
Yeah,
okay.
a fair bit.
So let's talk about something that's 25 years old, maybe 30 or 40 years old, close by. What would I buy that for as a freestanding property compared to these brand new townhouses where all of the shiny things are new? Is it around 1.1, 1.2, 1.3?
No.
No, a bit more? Yep.
Yeah, you could probably get a house for 1.7, 1.8.
Okay. So is that in the sort of same type of quality condition, or is it sort of a little bit more like, original condition?
Probably original, needing some work.
Yep. And so in terms of the land to asset ratio on that compared to the land to asset ratio on these new townhouses, because effectively most of it's going to be in the building, not necessarily in the land. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's always the risk when we're looking at these types of new type of investments, is that we're buying that developer freshness and newness around it. Now, the positives are we get a strong depreciation because it's brand new, okay, and we also potentially attract tenants because it's brand new. But at the end of the day, what's going to be the catalyst for the longer term growth is effectively the movement in land values in that area. So whilst we might get that, effectively what we're actually getting is a write down of that asset. So that's what depreciation is. And one day when we sell that, we've got to add that back to the final. If we do sell, we've got to add that back to the capital appreciation that we've had. So all it does give us is potentially a cash flow kick, but it doesn't necessarily give us, that value that we can bank. Whereas in that old freestanding home where we potentially could turn that into 2 or 3 townhouses ourselves, if it's on a larger block, potentially could give us a better return.
Now, you've been a Noosa local for some time. What you tell us? What are the drivers of lifestyle in Noosa? What are the things that people will demand in real estate in that particular market, in your view?
It depends at the level probably that people can purchase at. But I mean, we're a coastal town. We've got pristine beaches and national parks, and it's naturally beautiful. But it's quite a high-end market. There are quite a few holiday homes as well, so there's a complete mixture. A lot of the older places are obviously very established, but yeah, it's probably a hard market to probably break into.
It's a market like Bondi. It's iconic, where people want to be.
Brand is great.
The brand is really good. More people want to live there. So I guess some of the drivers that make that particular market unique, I think it sounds like, River, closer to Hastings Street, all those sorts of things. But I'd want to resist the temptation. Let's say that the development was a good one, right? I'd want to resist the temptation to be the first buyer. I'd want to be the second and subsequent buyer. So I'd want to buy in and remember, short term is 7 to 10 years for us. So if we've got a medium term outlook on that, I'd want to be one of the resales in there, despite the fact that we wouldn't get as much depreciation, it wouldn't be as shiny, so that I wasn't paying the brand new car price for that particular development. Cool.
Okay, yeah, great.
Can we talk a little bit more about lifestyle locations? But I'll need that graph to come up, Ivis. One of the things that's really important to understand is whenever you're looking at sustainable long-term demand, you're basically looking at this concept of the supply and the demand side around this wave of people that are moving through that demographic. So I'm gonna just show you a little bit of history of our fine country. And you can see here, I want to teach everyone in terms of how to read this chart. So the first thing we can see here in 1911, the bulk of our population was this young Australians. Right, so we were a young nation and we were pushing through into that, and you can see that demographic basically moving through and then obviously exiting this earth. Okay, and so when we then start to look at 1961, 2001 and 2021, we start to see some of the patterns that are emerging. Now, usually when we go into a retirement phase of our lives, we like those warmer locations and those lifestyle locations. So what's the problem when we go into those locations is what? Decreased population. Decreased population. The supply's not going anywhere, but the people are dying off. All right? So you need to be thinking about, okay, is that going to be an interesting spot for a younger generation? You also want to be thinking about the economic activity associated with that. So what's driving that economic activity? Did they make their money in southeast Queensland, or did they bring that money in from the farms that they run in, the southern states, or living in and working in Melbourne or Sydney or whatever that looks like? So that is a really important point in terms of, and this is why we're also seeing, we've got this quite a lot of cohort in this sort of baby boomer demographic. But what do we learn from the last election? the election was actually decided now by this next generation. So the Gen Zs are now coming through. And so we can see this is a cluster of that population now in its total existence in 2021. So we want to know where they want to live, right? And because where they go, they're income producing and they're productive, right? The older generation aren't productive. The production that they deliver us is actually healthcare and spending their money, which is great, as part of that. But ultimately, what we want to try and see is this pattern. And so where are these people setting up? So one of the great ways in which you can research this is if you can, and there are tools that can do this, is you put your SUA, so significant urban area or local government area in, and you profile the demographic in that area. Now, if the majority of that profile is in that sort of retiree stage, where's that energy and production going to come from if they're going to keep falling off their perch, right? And I know that sounds, a bit rude, but the reality is that, we're going into the business of running rental accommodation. We need to understand these patterns and these big patterns that are coming through. And if they are all moving, like, I love the Sunny Coast, and if there's a big young generation and a boom in young families that are in that area, that's a great sign. Okay, so if you're seeing this, these groups of families that are coming in and they're starting small businesses and they're starting to, make that area populous, then that's also a great sign as part of that. But it's certainly some of the fundamental research you should be thinking about when you're thinking about, okay, what's the wave of people coming into this area? Because it might be great to be buying there now because, and I've used this example before about caravans. Caravans are holding their value incredibly well at the moment because there's a truckload, there's 5,000 people who are coming through who are a week who are basically getting access to cash. So the four-wheel drive in the caravan, let's put that together. I've got 750,000 in my super. I'm happy to drop 150 on getting out and about. And so that's why there's this, but at some point in time, they will move off, but those vans aren't going anywhere. And then the next generation are about, 20 years from ready to buy potentially those vans. So there will be an oversupply and the market will adjust itself. And so that's what we've got to think about in terms of that. Now, we have immigration, we have a population story here in Australia, which also is why this whole thing has expanded as part of that story. But it's just something you want to be considering in terms of sustainable long-term land values, which is what appreciates over time. Making sense? Cool, thanks for letting me do that.
It's a good one. So the next one we've got here is from Rhys and Kat, who are with us. So now, for those of you who are listening to this, that's where they start to get a little bit nervous, but we'll make them feel comfortable. But you guys wrote in a question that talked about buffers, right? Do you remember this, Rhys? We talked about, you wrote the details too as well. Can I read, same question, right? But said, Bryce and Ben, we are terrible savers. We tend to buy houses so that we don't spend money. All right, I like the little checkmate that's going on there. We've had a budget for years, so I've always known we overspend. If we want to do something, we make it happen. I can hear you saying, pay yourself first and put the money somewhere you can't see it. The reality is that we are flying through life on a buffer of luck with a flag of determination waving in the air. This is good stuff.
Yeah, that's
so. Tell us a little bit more about what that looks like for you guys. So, So you've done a budget, but accumulating the buffer seems to be the challenge.
Yes. We have a spreadsheet. Still have a spreadsheet, and we still have lots of accounts, and we have the more platform, and we're not the typical overspenders that. Well, maybe I'm wrong here, but we're not the typical spenders that go out and waste money on those material things. I strongly believe in the enjoying life and giving the kids good memories, and we're both really time poor and have really big jobs. So when we do something, we like to do it in style, whether that's go to Fiji or we did a trip to New Zealand and we bought a dog, and we also went on a trip to Bali. So clearly,
New Zealand and bought a dog. Wow.
and then we settled on our our most recent property purchase
Yeah.
just after those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it just goes. It's that's the problem. Do you have something to add?
No, agree.
Completely agree. Because I'll quickly find what you said.
Yeah, let's bring that up.
We've done well with property so far, but with 2 young kids and a non-existent buffer, saving consistently has become a real challenge. What strategies would you recommend to improve our savings habits and building a strong financial buffer without losing momentum on our investment journey?
I'm surprised you didn't mention Amazon there.
Well, we should have a share in Amazon because the amount of delivery drivers that we get to our house is be crazy.
Yeah, good. So, all right. So there's a bit we can cover here.
Well, there's a lot to unpack.
Is it?
Well, the first thing there is, so you obviously order for convenience because you're time poor. Do you have a subscription to Amazon Prime where all deliveries are free? So it doesn't matter how many delivery drivers are coming there, as long as the produce or whatever you're buying has relevance to critical, important, nice to do, so what? Do you know what I mean? Like, what? So we all want to be the best parents, don't we? Like, we all want to give our kids the best opportunity, but potentially what does that opportunity look like? Is it experiences or is it things? And so, if we set expectations that every birthday's got to be magical and everything that we do has to be magical with them, that says more about, where you feel comfortable about what you're doing with yourselves than potentially, or the picture that you want to paint for them. I think if you bring them in on the conversation that you're having around what we're trying to do for your future, even though it may go over their head because they're quite young, but at the end of the day, you're still basically saying that, we're trying to, do some things here. And so set up the expectation around what we are going to be spending our money on for the short term to get ourselves into a position where we do have a buffer is going to be really important. So a delayed gratification piece around holidays is a good example. You can still have weekend breaks, but you don't necessarily have to jump on a plane to do that. You can still look at some of the experiences that you have that don't cost money, that don't have to be made up of, going into places where there's costs associated with the staffing and all those types of things. So picnics or whatever that may look like could also be part of that story. They're the main ones, and I think we've spoken before about the, what assets do you have in your home that are sitting there resting idle that could be worked on in terms of giving you confidence. But we've got to do some work on the decision making around the money. Okay, that's the part for mine.
How does this show up for you guys? Like, so what does it look like to not to not have the savings buffer? How does that turn up in your life?
It's terrifying. It's anxiety. It's stress that probably can be avoided, which probably then turns into spending, I think.
It's an emotional spend then, isn't it?
I think if something was to happen to either of us tomorrow, you start to think whether all of this has been for nothing, because you tend to then lose a property, which is obviously what you don't want to do. So, yeah, it's terrifying. It actually really is.
Can I ask a different question? And you might not have thought of it this way, but how is this actually not a problem for you? Like, how is running thin savings margins not a problem? Like, because if it was a massive problem, you would have changed it by now, and you haven't. So how is this not a problem for you?
I think it is a problem.
So what we've done is we don't do the pro rata tax. So we get the tax at the end of the year and we think, okay, with that, that'll be okay. And then stuff just happens to us. Like, we are so lucky. Like, Rhys will just get a bonus or, something will just happen. And we just seem to be always fine. And I don't know if it's that positive mindset. I mean, I've never been a good saver. I've had credit cards when I was younger. And again, it's that you're right, Bryce. It's the emotional thing. It's about until you work out what the emotional issue is, where you go and spend to relieve that, we are not going to change.
Well, I think we both try and make each other happy too. So when one has a great idea that involves money, the other person tends to say yes.
All in.
That's probably.
Yeah. Because I would say to you, we'd want to understand what money stories you've come from, what money normal is for you. But the reality is it's not a problem to the extent that there's a bigger trade-off for you that serves a more it serves as a more positive reinforcement for you. So the fact that the Amazon stuff comes is that gives you more upside than the downside of worrying about it. The going to Fiji gives you more upside than the downside of worrying about it. So so it's a mixture for me of money story, but also the pain associated with cutting out those things is greater than the pain of you running redlining. So to me, I would get together and I would stack the pain. I would actually sit together and work out if we don't fix this, what does it look like? Now you just gave a little bit there, Rhys, where you said, I worry if one of us was to not be here, would it be all worth it? We have to. So because every dollar that you save is a deposit into your own independence, right? The feeling that you get of being okay. And at the moment, it sounds like an emergency car, kids falling over and knocking their teeth out, and you're just one little something away from this this mild anxiety becoming a real problem. So I would personally just continue to stack the pain. I'd write it out. What happens if we run out of money? The kids could be at risk. Our jobs, whatever it is, because until the pain of change is less than the pain of staying the same, we're going to have this conversation in a year. We're going to have this conversation in 2 years. So we need to find a way that the two of you get together and stack the pain, because there's some money story stuff and there's some other stuff where you don't want to trade off the endorphin hits that you currently get from all those other things because the pain's not high enough. Otherwise, you would have done it by now. For as long as we shuffle in our seat to get more comfortable, we do that in our own life as well. And how does that sound? How does that land?
Makes complete sense. Absolutely.
Does everybody know what the number one driver for significant behavioural change is? Like, this is scientifically assessed. Does anyone know what it is?
It's like death.
Yeah, it's close to, so yeah, it's on that sort of wavelength. It's actually trauma. So a significant trauma will change behaviour. Like, I'm talking about a 180-degree change in behaviour. And what you were just saying there, Kat, was we sort of have been able to get through. So we haven't hit a trauma moment, because that trauma moment will change everything. And what our job and what we try and talk about is, let's not get to trauma. Let's try and give you the tools and the systems and the processes around running a 7-day float. And if there's no money there come, 2 days before payday, there's no money there. Open the pantry up and just make good with what you've got. So do those little things well, but we can't do the behavioural, that, and what we don't want to see is that bottom out trauma, right? But you'll see most of it is like, I was bankrupted and so I had to change my ways, or, I've lived on credit cards and I've just sort of found a way. So it's that big trauma that usually, life, a sudden death of someone, those types of things can change behaviour significantly. We spend a lot of our time talking about, mindset and that type of thing, trying to avoid that, trying to get to a stage where, okay, if we plan something and then we reward ourselves based on that plan. I mean, too much of society these days is basically not doing the hard, but still expecting, the support and the reward. I mean, I'd love our politicians to say, hey, I want lower taxes too, but here's what we have to do. We've got to grow the economic pie, and then our reward is lower taxes. And then see how the society responds to that. Because at the moment we just get more debt and lower taxes, and well, that just comes with more debt. So those little things are the things that I would love to see changes in anyone's household in terms of what they look like. And if you build those habits one step at a time, you'll start to make those changes.
You gave us a little insight there too, Rhys, in terms of, and it plays out in relationships all across the country, where in the absence of having these conversations, you two are being really brave from doing that, so I want to honour you for that to start with. But in the absence of, sometimes it's, again, stacking the pain. When we have difficult conversations with our partners, sometimes it's actually easy. There's a bigger payoff of sweeping it under the carpet than actually having the conversation, because you've got to choose your heart. And sometimes I go, well, I don't want to have that hard conversation now. I'll deal with the hard later. And so I think in that part of the stack the pain conversation, I'd be saying that too. I'd be saying, Rhys, I'd be saying to Kat, hey, listen, sometimes I make decisions based on the relationship where I think it's easier for me to say yes because I don't want to create any friction in our relationship. And talk openly about that, and then stack the pain around that, and invite the same back from you, Kat. What does it feel like when Rhys makes a concession because he's wanting to avoid friction in the relationship? But this is he said it at the beginning. But it's causing me anxiety. But the anxiety that's causing is less than the anxiety of perhaps letting down the relationship. And same for you. What does it mean for you? Have you built habits and behaviours in the relationship over the time that just a little 1% of today, a little 1% of today, and then we go, how do we get here? How come we don't talk about money anymore? How come we're not having those hard conversations anymore? Because I've done it in my own relationship. We've all done it. We go, it's just easier to say yes than to actually have that difficult decision. But I guess the crux of the conversation is around you guys getting a sense of peace that feels good for you guys, because you guys are doing, like Kat, you are fastidious at wanting to learn this stuff. You are hungry. You are very clear on what you want. So that's the great stuff. Let's lean on that. You're buying investment properties. We know that statistically you're an outlier. So let's lean on that. It seems like you got most sorted out. It seems like we've just got to have some difficult conversations around the money that I reckon once you do have those conversations, and your goal is to stack the pain on and maybe do it separately first, and then stack the pain so much so that the pain of change is less than the pain of staying the same. That's the threshold that we want to exceed, because then once we've stacked the pain, and to Ben's point, we can simulate the trauma. You don't actually have to have the trauma. We can just simulate the trauma. And by stacking the pain, once we do get to that, we go, oh my gosh, like that price is way too much to pay. Let's do that. Let's do the 7-day float. If we don't have the money for it, they're all platitudes that you hear Ben and I say each week, and it's easy to have a 7-day float, and it's easy not to pay. If you run out of ingredients on a Friday, you just open the pan like that. They're actually hard to do in reality. They're not easy to do. So, but helpful.
Yeah,
Hugely.
You're so right with us accommodating for each other. Like we don't say no to each other.
You're not alone. Yeah, and something was set up in the relationship a long time ago that meant that was easier than the anxiety that you're feeling, Rhys. But mate, imagine if you got, you guys are having those regular conversations. You're only spending what you, if you can't go to Fiji, you don't, and you don't give each other a hard time around the decision to say no because we're going next year. We're not going this year. They're the tough conversations you've got to have, and I promise you, I've had them with my wife as well. So I'm not suggesting something that I wouldn't do myself. So cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. We'll give you an update in a year.
Cool.
Reset expectations, and I want you to, over the next 2 to 3 months, track every dollar that you spend in every category, and sit down and say to yourself, is that what we want to be spending our money on?
But here's the chance. We've had the conversation. Let's you've got all these witnesses here around this
publicly
room
acknowledged now.
Let
us be your accountability partners.
The difficult conversations, they're hard to have, but gosh, once you get to the other side.
Ben, you'll be excited to hear. He's like, I'm happy to use the 7-day float or more if I can figure out how to use it. It's because I've got all the other numbers in.
We'll do training straight after this, right? All right. Well, you're not leaving this room until you and I sit down and work it out.
Thank you, guys. That was really cool.
It's hard. I think for something like that, and it is embarrassing. It's terrible. But I feel like if we're going through it, then there's probably other people out there as well.
There are tons of people out. Tons. There's people that come in with credit card bills that would blow your hair back, because the pain of having a 6-figure credit card bill is less than the pain of having a real conversation with your partner about letting it down. I promise you're not alone. I promise you that is happening all over this country. So, but you guys are the brave ones who are prepared to have a conversation around it. Yeah. But you guys are doing great. Yep. So Will, you had a question around some structures, and we talked a little bit about it before we started recording this. But my partner and I spent a lot of time learning about different ways to structure bank accounts, companies, trust, etc. So much so that we're now totally confused, which is fair. We ask accountants and they give us very basic responses. Are we asking the wrong questions? Are we asking the wrong people? Is there such thing as a savvy, structure-based accountant that sees the future and gets excited about how to strategically build a small, everyday couples portfolio? One that understands business and personal investment portfolios and how to have the two complementing each other, not working in isolation? Or is it only the spruikers that make us believe that such people exist? What a good question.
Sorry, long-winded, wasn't it?
No. So what have we learnt over this trusts and structures have become a more mainstream way. Setting up companies is really easy now. Setting up trusts is really easy now. A lot of accountants know the basics around that type of thing. But what have we learned about how the government reacts to those types of structures? Anyone? If too many people are using them, they'll change the rules. I mean, we're seeing a new legislation trying to get passed right now. Was it 296, I think, whatever it is, around $3 million. So they're going after the people who have got. They're using super as their tax effective structure. So having had unit trusts, companies, family trusts, and those types of things, I think any accountant who's genuine is probably going to have to still tell you that I'm giving you this advice based on the policies and the regulations today, and there are pros and cons of each structure in terms of asset protection and all of those other elements. But I think an honest accountant should also say that if too many people structure successfully to minimise their tax, then the government will try and work out a way of finding a way to tax you on those gains. So I think it is important that we acknowledge that. Off the back of that though, if your accountant, and this is for anyone who's listening, if your accountant isn't asking you questions about what the end game looks like, and for them to try and get an understanding of what you're trying to achieve, and I think good accountants will also ask you how big you want to grow the pie that you're trying to grow. So whether it's business or whether it's investing in property, how many of these things are we thinking we're going to own, right? And then off the back of that, you'll probably get the advice around structuring. What we've consistently said from day dot is that we would like to see people just invest in their personal names if there's no risk. And again, I can't give advice around that. But as you build knowledge and skill and understanding, you may then, have the competencies to go and do that. There's a lot of people trying to push people into trust structures for lending access and also self-managed super fund. We've been consistent about those, and they are very complex structures. They carry with it a lot of requirements and regulatory understanding. So we want you to be able to demonstrate that you have the financial literacy and capacity to be able to handle that type of structure. And that only comes through learning and through demonstration. So what we would do if someone was sitting down with our financial planners and say, oh, well, a friend of ours on the mines told us we need to set up a self-managed super fund, because everyone's setting them up. It's like, well, I want to have a look at your financial situation and see just how competent you are around managing money. Who does that? Who does all the compliance work? Who does the bookkeeping? And if they're all over the shop, there is no way known that is a suitable structure for them. Because remember, you can outsource the compliance work, but you can't outsource the responsibility. So if you're a director of a company or someone is looking after these responsibilities, you've got these legal obligations. And if you don't serve them correctly, you will be prosecuted, fined, and potentially see financial loss associated with those. So I'm always of the view that it's a case by case. And I know what you're sort of saying around that who should I speak to? I would like to have my financial planner and my accountant in concert on those conversations around pros and cons. And if they're complementing each other in what they're saying and it's aligned to my clear sets of goals, then I feel like I've got a team of people, because it's not just one professional advisor these days. Under our regulation and our licensing, you're going to have usually, your Australian credit license, your AFSL, which is your Australian Financial Services license, you're going to have your tax agent license, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to be able to bring that team of people together, and if they're really clear in terms of what your objectives are, and they can help you think about those objectives, then the reality is it's still not going to be perfect, but at least you can take one foot forward with some level of confidence and then hopefully keep moving forward. But mark my words, the government will take some of your money at some point if you're very successful at what you do.
I think that's our struggle, is trying to set it up so we have the accountant and financial planner and everybody talking to each other. You get an idea from one, and then you go to the accountant, and you've got to present the idea to them, rather than them being able to help you build the bigger picture as well. I suppose, and a lot of people in this room, as we discovered at lunch, are self-employed as well. So we've got separate companies. Yeah. If you're having a good year in that company, you don't want to pay the tax. How can we get that out in an efficient way to help us build wealth? So when we're having a poor year, that can help lift us. And there's just a lot of complexity. And you look at the older generation, they all seem to say, oh yeah, you need a trust, they're all got these things they've set up in the past. But then you find out that when they try to get their wealth out of the trust, it still costs them money in tax, and it's very confusing.
Yeah, and there's no perfect system, because again, the government will keep changing the rules. So if we understand that, but what I would say is, and this is also what the research says when consumers are surveyed around financial services, ideally they would like one or a couple of people in a holistic business to be able to handle that for them, and so they can go to one source of truth. That's about 65% of people want that type of solution. So if you're an accountant and your financial advisor in two different businesses, which is completely fine, but what I would say is get them together for that same meeting, because it's lost in translation. And and normally I tell you what happens, because I've done these round tables before, is I want to set the agenda up in terms of, with my people, it's like, hey, there's no such thing as a silly question. And I know where everyone's going to try and be polite and professionally polite in terms of the discussions, but I want to get to the core of what we're doing here with this family, this family wealth in your particular case, right? And so that means that it's okay if you disagree, but I want to understand the merits on what we're disagreeing on, so we can all get some sort of clarity. Now, if we can't get clarity in that particular case, then we time out, we go back and reset. But in most cases, there's got to be some learning going on for those people, because it's not their pure wheelhouse. So that's why they'll be really restrictive. But as long as everyone's opening the conversation around that, it makes a lot of sense that you're then going to get all of your advisors on the same page and hopefully moving forward. But it does require coordination, and you're expecting them to deliver it to you, but unfortunately you're paying them, and so they'll expect some guidance from you as well in terms of what your overall goals are.
I'll give you a lived experience around that, Will. In 2007, 2008, I was working for a property group who was partnered with an accounting group. And they had come up with a trust that was designed to be perfect for property investors. Now, the challenge with that was, because I'm talking to the spruik a bit, right? So the challenge is that at face value, it sounds very sexy what was being offered at the time. But I was the guy that I was the next person in line that needed to execute on that. So I talked to a client, and they'd set up one of these structures that was being marketed as amazing. And so for the people just listening at home, the options that were available for someone to get finance in their own name were as wide as my arms could stretch, right? But as soon as we added the trusts into the conversation, those lending options diminished greatly, to the point where it was very difficult for me to get my job done, to move the client through to the next stage. So I had this real challenge with, it wasn't my company, I was working for someone else. I had this challenge where I had to do what I was asked to do in the role, but I fundamentally didn't believe it was the right thing for the client. And it was eating me up, right? But that is the reality of what we sometimes face, where the front-facing promotion of what we should do can't get executed in the back room very, very easily. So, I mean, I double click on all that Ben says. I run a business, so I've got a family trust with a trustee company and a bucket company, right? And then all the properties are owned with the exception of one that was in my name before I met my wife, all the other properties are owned in her name, not mine. And then I have a self-managed super fund. So that's the complexity of the structures that I have, but I try and keep it as simple as possible. And to the extent that Ben said before, I'm not looking to add any complexity to those structures without any benefit or payoff. That I get the legal protection from my wife owning the properties. I have the structures available for me to earn my income, and then I utilise the super fund. So knowing what I was exposed to, and knowing your story, because you're a farmer, for those who are listening to this, you're a farmer and you have variable income and you're subject to seasons and weather and all those sorts of things. Clearly there's a speciality that's required for your farming practice, but I haven't come across too many nirvana solutions where there's an accountant that has this beautiful sort of outlook that I know that I should minimise your tax, but I also want to optimise your wealth at the same time. They usually, let's get your tax down as much as we possibly can. Then you have to talk to someone else who says, let's optimise your wealth. So I think the best solution is what Ben said is you just become the orchestra in the band, just going, okay, I have to know enough to know the right questions to ask to get the specialists who can talk. And I think that's where the real skill and the art comes. And you're sitting next to another fellow farmer who's got a similar question around some of that stuff as well. Like, these are the things that you guys experience that the people in the city folk, we wouldn't understand what you're doing. But it's about optimising the farming business and then looking for ways to store the wealth outside of farming, whilst also making sure that you manage seasonality, great crop, rubbish crops, all that sort of stuff. So my lived experience is that having done this now for 27 years, that there is no amazing nirvana that I've come with. There's some really good operators. There's definitely some really good operators, but no nirvana who's there to optimise both sides, unless you're having conversations like what we're having, Ben.
Yeah, and I can't think of any tax schemes that have ended well. So I think about the primary production tax schemes, when they were doing all of the trees, and you could buy into the trees, and that basically meant you could get all this tax advantage. And as these crops were growing, that ended very poorly. I'm trying to think of the Great Southern Plantations, I think, is one of the examples of that. And so accountants were selling it, financial planners were selling it, ended up blowing up badly, everyone losing pretty much most of their money. Any type of tax scheme that's a blatant minimisation around tax, the people who made all the money were the guys getting the commission, the financial planners and the people selling it, not so much the end investor. So, and that's also true for anyone who promotes a property scheme, such as a hybrid investment trust for investment properties or whatever it is. Just run a mile, go to the fundamentals, and be happy to pay some level of tax. If you're making profits, then it's not a bad thing to be paying some tax.
Cool.
Thank you.
What you needed? Beautiful, thank you. Hey, Prue, you asked a question. I mentioned there that you're also a fellow farmer. Your question related to being a business owner with highly variable income as farmers. What suggestions do you both have in relation to obtaining finance, loan structures and investment property purchases for people in this situation? We've made a profit farming for the last 20 years, except last year due to terrible farming conditions. It's been interesting to see the language of the farmers on this trip, isn't it? Like, how many meals did you get? Like, how many meals are you expecting? It's a different language that we
what bag crops do you get? Yeah. What yield are you getting?
My husband and I are both 43 with 3 teenagers. We have one investment property in Adelaide being used as an Airbnb that we can access when we visit our daughters who are in boarding school. Here's the question, Ben. Are investment properties a good idea when we have a lot of capital already tied up in farming land? Thanks so much. Prue.
Yes. And having married into a farming family, get that out. Yeah, not quite. I've seen some financial books over the journey, and it's fascinating in terms of looking at land to asset ratios and the debt levels that the guys have to go into. I mean, it is a tough business, farming, right? I mean, at the end of the day, in any business you want to be in control of the outcome. Unfortunately, farmers are not, because they can't control the weather. Okay, so that is the biggest challenge that they have, and a couple of bad years can obviously set the farm back a decade or even more. So being really careful around the levels of debt that they go into is really, really important. And when I see farms that have debt to asset ratios of 60, 70, 80%, I'm like, that's one season or, away from obliteration in terms of what that looks like. So let's try and put some context around that for the good years. And sometimes we do have, when we have good years and we have great years as farmers, what you want to basically be looking at is, well, what are you doing around that investment? So there's obviously farming equipment that we've got to replenish. We've got to be looking at, obviously, banking enough working capital for at least a couple of years in farming. And I'm no expert in this space, so that's true. But it comes back to this question about inconsistent income. A couple of ways in which we would normally deal with that is taking an average of the last 3 years as one way of doing it. And one of the things we spoke about earlier today was this idea of having a buffer that's not necessarily just a cash buffer, but it's an equity buffer. So in other words, one thing farmers do have is usually a lot of equity in their land and so forth. So part of how you can potentially manage through difficult periods is to have a little bit of that. And I've just sort of said that's dangerous in the farming side. But one of the great things about property is that it is illiquid, which means it doesn't have the same sort of volatility that shares have. So you just don't get that really big corrections like when Donald Trump announces, wasn't Independence Day, what was it? It was Retribution Day, or whatever it was.
No, it was, it'll come to me.
Yeah,
you go.
Tariff Day. Let's call it tariff. I mean, and the market collapsed by 20%. You just don't see that sort of event happening, overnight in property. Liberation Day. So there you go. Thank you. So I'd be just sort of looking at, again, it's a case by case, so I don't know how much exposure you have in the farm in terms of debt position, but I would be looking at, remember, what debt management does is buy you time. So if you've had a couple of really good years, I normally would, and the same sort of thing in the property side, I load it up in lines of credit. So if I knew that my situation was potentially going to change, I'm just going to release all that money out and park it. And I don't have the undisciplined problem in terms of the temptation to go and spend that on anything other than it making more money for me. So I'd probably be looking at a way in which I can potentially release that equity and keep a bit of that equity, not so much in cash, but in potentially something that I can draw on as part of that. But it's not easy.
I think that you and I had a conversation at the back of the bus when we were driving to East Java, and you said that I might be paraphrasing. You said it's kind of a bit unfair because the principal place of residence exemption that people get all across this country, sometimes for farmers, isn't fair because the value of their principal place of residence is not. It doesn't have that eternal growth that someone in the big city would have. So, I think that's true, and I don't think there's any way to create fairness around that. So for me, therefore, that gives the that rises the need to keep that diversity where you can. So clearly, I'm a proponent for a property, so you'd expect me to say, yes, I think you should. But I also think the access to liquid assets is important for you. So if you don't do what Ben says around having a cash buffer, well then chasing a portion of your portfolio that might be in, because the nature of property that makes it so good is that it is illiquid because no one can make panic sales and all that sort of stuff. But when you need that cash, when you've got those fluctuating seasons, that's different for the way that you earn a living and that you run a business. So there might be other equity-based investments that you could also build up as well, so that you do have that liquidity. But clearly, I'm a proponent that you would continue to buy investment properties, and you have done that. You've already got one. So I'd be interested in what your appetite is for expanding the portfolio based on that as a backdrop, being a farmer and not knowing if you should have that extra diversity.
Yeah, I'm happy to take on, I'm definitely interested in more investment properties. And I have taken both of your advice by, first of all, when we did buy it, I put it on a redraw, and then I've actually changed it to an offset account. So we've got money. We did have a good farming year the last 2 years. Well, not last year, the 2 years before. So I was able to park quite a bit of money on that offset account. So sort of it's positively geared, which is really good. So it's sort of like having that cash buffer there without having to pay the interest on the investment property while we are having a tough year. I haven't got the cash, but yeah, at least I'm not paying anything off the investment property at the moment. So it does give me that flexibility, which has been really good.
Yeah, I mean, I know you're part of a farming group that sort of tries to educate people about, how to get their farms performing well, but also off-farm investments. And I think, I've talked to James' family about that a bit in terms of when you are having good years, what are you setting aside for that rainy day? And, they've had a couple of houses that they bought years ago, their grandparents bought on the beachfront, which were just beach shacks where they had their holidays, but, they're gold mines now in terms of the land value there. So I do like this idea of if you've had a couple of good years that you don't put all the money back into just that. You basically try and take some out and diversify the same way in which we would always think that diversifying in investment is also a good idea.
And I think that sort of goes against traditional norms of a lot of farming where you just keep reinvesting into the farm and growing it, and the farm eventually will pay for your retirement. But yeah, I like this concept of being able to cover ourselves and perhaps hand the farm on to the kids, but having something for ourselves to retire on.
Mm. And just help with that anxiety that comes from the dependence on something that you're not fully in control of, right? When you, because I don't pretend to understand what you're going through. I don't have any understanding other than observations and conversations I have with people like you. But it would seem that some of those outside observations mean that all of the energy and effort that goes into that, and then something happens that's outside of their control. It appears that it would be nice to have that choice or that diversity that means that something happens over here, I've got this over here. Yeah. Hey, thanks for sharing that. Hey, our last question today comes from Adam. Now, Adam, for our listeners, he's this will be his second time appearance, given that he was a summer series guest.
Yep.
And what I did love about the name of the episode is Meet the Outlier, how a 32-year-old has a $3.4 million property portfolio to fund his love of travel. Well, he's walking the talk, mate.
You said that. Any great idea I'm on, I'm coming.
And I must admit, I announced this tour not long after we recorded with Adam, and I did have a little thing in the back of my mind going, I wonder if he'll actually come on, but you did, mate. So it's been wonderful to get to know you over these last few days. Your question was, my portfolio is 3.4. You've got an 3.4 million. You've got an LVR of 59%. Your loans are all interest only at 1.64 million. In your personal name times 3, and 1's in a trust, which was your commercial property. You have a personal income in that circa 1 to 120. And you're concerned that when these come off interest only in 2027 and you go to refinance it, the banks will not lend to you due to your serviceability. All right, real question. So ideally, I would like to keep them all as currently you're servicing all these fine. But if I did have to sell, how should I assess which properties to sell, considering location, yield, future growth potential, land size for future development, etc.? So there's a couple of questions there, Ben, around interest only, what happens when interest only comes off and we renegotiate, and then if I did have to sell, how would we create a framework for selling?
A couple of quick ones. Is the portfolio washing its own face?
Yeah. It's not like I'm having to go to work every day to fund.
Yep, which is what we've talked about. Yeah, that's good.
It's more around the bank, around me having to do it to show the bank that I can fund them.
Well, I mean, the reality is you're going to have already a strong relationship with the bank in terms of your credit history and your ability to service that debt. So that's number one. So you want to start forming a relationship with who your lenders are, because in terms, I'm going through a similar situation right now where a couple of our loans have come off 5-year interest-only periods, and I want to roll to another 5 years, and that is a credit critical. And so what that means is you've got to put another application up. And so you're sort of going through that. Now, they can see on my banking, they can see the amount of money that I've got in offset accounts and so forth. So that in itself should mean that it's a pretty straightforward exercise. You've got until 2027. So what we want to be able to do is, where we can, is to try and build up that buffer. Okay. So if we can build up that buffer, how many lenders are we working with currently? 3. Okay. So I would, before that time, I'd try and see whether I could explore getting at least 2 of them with one lender, and then try and have a conversation with that lender around their appetite for rolling one over, and then potentially the other one going to P&I. And in the interim, building up your offset, so you're in a situation where you've got enough to cover that P&I, which means you don't have the pressure on your exertion income for a period of time. Because remember, this is, because if they're all rolling over at roughly the same time, that's your pain point. So what we're trying to do is basically exhaust all of that and stretch them out. And, you know, let's try and eat the elephant one bite at a time rather than going to try and do all 3 and just give them a run at that sort of conversation.
Hey, but from memory and from the conversations, you're a diligent guy anyway. So you don't spend money frivolously unless it's around experiences like what you're doing now. So I think, you know, even in that time, your portfolio's rental will grow. The commercial property will ideally have factored into that lease increased income, which, you know, that further reinforces the positive cash flow that you have on that property. I'm not anticipating that there's going to be challenges for you, knowing who you are personally and who you surround yourself with. But I think
you are forced to sell, yeah.
To the final question there around if you did have to sell them, I think you've actually answered that in the question, because you're actually developing a matrix around, okay, well, I've got these properties, and then so you put the addresses at the top, and down the left you do the criteria on which you want to decide. So you put in the question, you know, I've got to consider their location, what yields they're getting, their future growth potential, any foreseeable development opportunity. That all becomes part of the matrix when you're making these decisions, because, you know, there's recycle costs, how much we think we're going to get by keeping that one, the opportunity cost versus the other one. So I think you're in the right headspace around what that looks like. But ultimately, you will want to have clarity around North Star, the line, because we might make an assumption, you sell the one that's got the least potential for capital growth. But then we might not understand that you need more income. So by selling one that has better income with less capital growth, we might actually undo the very goal that we're trying to achieve. So
I think, from me coming on the podcast with you guys, it really made me then come away, have a real good sit down, think like how much I got from that, the position I'm in now. And I think I've got this amazing opportunity to shape the life into what I really want. And I almost feel like if I was to sell 1 or 2 or something, I could be doing this a couple of times a year. I could be, like, I don't need to be working every day to keep a $3.4 million property portfolio, you know.
Yeah. Wow. The richest man in the graveyard is still in the graveyard, isn't he?
I'd be happy after everything to have $500 a week and be helping people like we have the last few days. Like,
that's a cool position.
So it's almost, like, I feel like there's a possibility to turn that into reality, but it's, what do I do to do that?
Yeah, there's a couple of other things in there as well. This is how powerful loss aversion is, that people will come to us and say, this one's done really well, so let's sell that. This dud over here, I'm going to wait until it actually starts making money. Right? And so you're like, wait a minute, you're selling your best performer and you're keeping, it's like saying, you know, okay, I'm going to sell Apple or Microsoft or something like that, and I'm going to keep some little 2-bob company over here because it's gone backwards. So again, it is still case by case in terms of what we'll look at, but hopefully some of the fundamentals we've discussed this morning around what is the economic activity of where that property is located more broadly, what's the likelihood of that economic growth, that town growing or that city growing. So if you've got them well located, those assets over the decades will probably still perform better than some that might be in, say, regional areas or whatever it may look like. So that's maybe a starting point, and then it is coming down to that case-by-case story in terms of, okay, well, what are we trying to achieve? You know, and then how do we restructure that?
Is your lifestyle currently, between now and 2027, restricted from what you want to do to what you can do?
No, there's no restrictions at all. It's more me thinking, okay, come 2027, if I was to say stop work or only work 6 months of the year, the banks then look at, you've only made 50 grand each of the last 2 years. You've got $2 million in debt. We're not going to lend to you. And then, what do I do now?
So I guess I think the wonderful thing is you've positioned yourself to have a wonderful choice at that point in time. Anyway, so
Just want to make the most of that, right?
knuckle down, keep doing what you're doing, build up those buffers, and at that sort of 6 to 9 months out from needing to make that critical decision, just reassess. And when you get the refinancing, it's probably not like you're going to have just left. You'll have thought well in advance about what your next sort of stage of embarking on your travel odyssey would look like. So I think I've got a feeling you'll be all right, mate. I've got a feeling.
One of the considerations around that, in terms of purpose and contribution, there's quite some interesting stuff that even Scott and I were speaking about on the bus on one of the trips up there was, let's say hypothetically 5 more years of what you're doing now with the working that you're doing can potentially buy you 10 years of doing that contribution work or 20 years of doing that, as opposed to stopping now could buy you 2 years of doing that before things have to change. So have a think about, what that looks like as well, because you're on the precipice of getting over the hill. And then when you're over the hill, it's the view's pretty good from there. And then ultimately that then will give you that opportunity to do all the things that you want to do. Because you might be going, all right, I'm willing to take that step back now because I'm so passionate about that opportunity, which is great. And if the strength in that position is so great, money's nothing, right? At the end of the day, it's nothing. But if you can potentially push through for 5 more years, you're only 30 odd, then you could be doing this for 15, 20 years, as part of that story, right?
And you were definitely lit up, mate, in the village. I could see that was something that was passionate for you. Kimmy.
Just related to that though, I thought if you have an interest-only loan, that after the 5 years, doesn't it just sort of vary?
That's traditionally how it will roll over, but you don't accept the bank's decision. Ultimately, you can still go back and say, so that's right, it will. So my loan is switched over to P&I, or 2 of them, and I'm saying, well...
so he doesn't need to make another application, right?
No, but it's the cost of that, right? So in other words, you're only paying interest on the loan. The principal component on 3 loans of that debt size is literally hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of extra dollars a month. Right. So that's why. So then all of a sudden it absorbs all of your liquidity.
So worst case.
Yeah. So because the other part of that, I'm saying to my bank, if you don't give it to me, I can just go and reset a loan with another bank.
Yeah.
And I'll get that money. And so they don't want to lose.
Particularly when they look at your history and your offset account balance and
the fact that all of the business banking's there as well. You're like, okay, we need to get this sorted. Yeah. So there's always a common sense approach to banking in terms of the bankers have to make. At the end of the day, they're in the business of lending money, okay, and they're lending that at a risk return assessment that they're making, but this is unfortunate where sometimes regulation comes in. APRA comes in and says, you can only have up to 5 years, so you've got to potentially get dispensation in some cases. Well, what do? I just pick up that loan and I go and set it with another lender. AMP just announced a 10-year interest-only term, right? And they're saying the market has changed, and for owner-occupiers. All hell broke loose and it's not good and it's teaching bad behaviours. At the end of the day, they're in the business of lending money and meeting customers' needs. And hopefully the customer will do the right thing in terms of how they manage their money. But what we don't want to have is a nanny estate where basically, everything's so regimented and regulated. That's how productivity dies. That's how innovation dies. So off the back of that, we've got to make sure that let the market be the market, and hopefully they can roll those loans over and reset that, or I'm just going to take my business elsewhere. So that's an option that's available.
All right, folks, as we bring to a close another episode of The Property Couch, we want to thank all of the people who have joined us, Ben, for the last 3 days. This is officially the time when they get to go back to their holiday because they've been with you and me for the last 3 days and then spent all of today with us. But we want to thank all of our guests for contributing the questions that you shared today. Hopefully they were a benefit to you listening at home. But it's been, mate, I've got to say thank you for...
You mean I don't even have to do what's making property news or any of that sort of stuff? Can I just go straight to the wrap-up?
No, well, what they wouldn't have seen is us scrambling at the beginning to make sure that we get it. But thanks for coming off the couch in Australia, mate. And
a happy birthday, mate, and congratulations.
Yeah.
We haven't said the amount of money that you've raised yet.
I did at the beginning, but didn't I?
No. You said it was a lot of money, more than you expected.
Yeah, well, so we set out to do 50,000. So what people can't see at home is Ivis is now scrambling in the background to make sure that she can get that number for us.
Well, we can say it's over $75,000.
The official number was $74,592.98.
There we are. Very good.
So thank you to each and every one of you that contributed to a wonderful cause. I can promise you, as we stand here today, this very moment, up until last night, there was 262 people who got their eyesight back then. The previous record was 100 people in a day. The first day, they did 127. Second day, they did 135. And as my sons were doing the maths last night, that came to 262. So we're actually hoping that for the third day in a row, they break the record and get, now I've lost my maths, 138 people that get their sight back today. So over the period of 3 days, that means that they'll have helped 400 people. And we will get well in excess of 500 because we only needed $50,000 for this experience.
Yep.
And then the remaining money will go to another experience. So I said, can we give it to the kids? Because the kids have to go into the hospital. And can we give it to a remote village where it's very difficult to get to make sure that those people. So thank you.
Do you want to shout out Cass as well from the great organisation?
I do. From Love Heart Organisation, she was the conduit to help us, help the people in the village. It was an idea. We connected. Cass and my wife got together. Stiggy was involved. There was just a wonderful collaboration. So so we just want to thank Cass for that wonderful opportunity. And folks, we've actually been able to stretch it a little longer. So you can still donate if you want to. So thepropertycouch.com.au/donation. These people definitely need these funds. We've seen it up front, and we've seen it. It's now personal to us, and it's now personal to everyone in this room. So boy, oh boy, are we motivated.
And I said over 75,000, so we've got to get to that number now because I said it. So.
Exactly. So if you're watching at home, the link will be here. If you're listening, it's thepropertycouch.com.au/donation. So what has been a wonderful week, Ben, as we sign off, and we thank our friends here in Bali. Until next week.
Well, happy birthday again, mate. Big 5-0.
When you said over the hill before, I thought you were talking about me, but it was just a question
that as well. Anyway, knowledge is empowering, but only if you act on it.
See you next week, folks. Woo. Thank you, Prue.